So, the process of demoralization could be stopped right here, both as an expert and as an import. And that takes one step, one very important thing to do. You don't have to expel all the KGB agents from Washington, D.C. The most difficult and at the same time the simplest answer to the subversion is to start it here and even before, by bringing back the society to religion, something that you cannot touch and eat and put on yourself, but something that rules society and makes it move and preserve it.
It's one of my favorite Chinese phrases. Sha ji sha hou. Kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. It describes the incentive of government to use violence or other ostentatious oppressive measures to keep the people in line. That it comes from a country ruled by communist overlords endows the expression with an air of gritty authenticity. I used to tell my fellow inmates in DC dock that we were the chickens of the Biden regime. The government was using our suffering to scare people into abandoning Trump and the MAGA civil rights movement. Those appeals to tyranny, violence, and fear appear to have backfired. Recall that throughout the 2024 election, the Harris campaign endlessly intoned about the supposed dark age that would befall America should Harris not become the rightful guardian of our open borders and baby-killing factories. It didn't work, just like it failed in Britain in 2016 when the country voted to leave the European Union. The goal of scaring the British citizens into voting Remain was a deliberate PR campaign based on fear. So much so, in fact, that it was christened Project Fear by detractors on the Leave side. The impression was so strong that Project Fear is how the campaign is referenced to this day, even in election scholarship. The Remain side took umbrage at the characterization and criticized the term as overly cynical. But even before the vote, some leftists actually leaned into it, arguing that invoking fear in this scenario is the right thing to do. In an article titled "In Praise of Project Fear" by Anatol Kaletsky in Prospect magazine, he describes the goal of Project Fear in the kind of annoying paternal language that leftists normally reserve for their internal monologues. Quote, Boris Johnson describes it as Project Fear, but there's another name for the strongest argument for Britain to stay in the European Union. A parent telling a child not to play with matches, or a friend who prevents a drunken companion from getting into the driver's seat, calls this common sense. Politicians who describe the economic risks of Brexit are castigated for trying to frighten the voters, and advised by media commentators to present a positive, idealistic story. But when we try to stop a drunk from driving or a child from setting fire to the curtains, we don't appeal to their idealism or remind them of the joys of life. We warn of the terrible consequences that could result from the reckless actions, and in doing this, our burden of proof is very low. We don't need to prove that the house will burn down or an innocent pedestrian will be run over. It is enough to say that the drunk driving makes a calamity more likely and is therefore bad. Kaletsky makes the point that because it's Leave that's arguing for British citizens to take on the risks associated with cutting ties with the European Union, they're the ones who have to provide the data to support their claims. Quote, if anything, the burden of proof between facts and forecasts should be reversed. The Brexit camp are the ones now advocating risky and unpredictable changes. It is therefore incumbent on them to explain exactly how Britain would benefit from Brexit and why their predictions about sovereignty should be believed. Supporters of the status quo, by contrast, have no need to predict the future because they rely on established facts. Kletsky knows this is an impossible task. One cannot prove from data what has not yet happened. The fact of the matter is, Project Fear itself also made unfounded assumptions about Brexit, forecasting what they could not substantiate. It was true that voters were being asked to take a risk, but it was Remain that failed to adequately support their arguments. Yet, that wasn't the last time fear was used as a motivator. The COVID scare of 2020 was one of the greatest examples of government weaponizing fear, on a global scale no less, to get the whole population to willingly comply with their draconian lockdowns, magical masks, invisible 6-foot virus-proof bubbles, and vaccine passports. Whether people want to openly acknowledge it or not, I suspect the lingering impression in the aftermath of those years is that we caved too easily in the name of fear. In a way, COVID inoculated minds on a massive scale to fear-mongering as a manipulative tactic. But you can't blame the left for resorting to fear. It's an effective tactic that bypasses rational checks and immediately puts people in an emotional fight-or-flight mode. At the same time, I think there's an acknowledgement that it's lost a good deal of its efficacy. What I'm noticing now is that the left is conducting a campaign organized around a different emotion: demoralization. It's a logical countermove in the aftermath of 2024 and in light of the intervening months where the Democrat Party has boldly staked its claims on the losing side of every 80-20 issue. It's clear that what the left lacks most is enthusiasm. They've been beaten and then subsequently allowed themselves to be humiliated on a grand scale. We're talking about the leadership of a party that still believes they can revive the trans fad, the party that mocked the live murder of a good man, the party that spares no expense or effort in protecting illegal aliens, but then gladly burns their SNAP beneficiaries for weeks just to try to get street cred for an off-year election, and ultimately no concessions on the budget negotiations to show for it. If anyone has a morale problem, it's definitely the left. So it makes sense that they try to replicate this on the right. This has been the implicit goal of major PR pushes by the Democrat Party for the better part of this year. For example, Dems jumped on the Epstein files suddenly this year when it was completely irrelevant every year prior. There's also been an effort to transmit a good deal of their anti-Israel sentiment over to the right. The preferred vehicle for this have been pundits who suddenly claim to be right-wing but have never actually embraced or espoused conservatism. They do things like praise socialist or communist dictators and preach racist ideas like some sort of leftist caricature of a conservative. A lot of these talking points have successfully bled into the work by more mainstream commentators on the right, people who I've taken to task before this year, but also include that right-wing faction of America First, which defines itself by an irrational belief that America shouldn't even have positive relationships with other countries. Many of these people took the Panikin route when it came to the successful scuttling of the Iranian nuke program, claiming that such a move was inexplicable when the rationale was stark and self-evident and could be explained as simply as saying, Iranian nukes, bad. When the strikes ended in success and it became clear that it was Trump who had Netanyahu on a short leash and not vice versa, not a single one of these commentators issued a correction or mea culpa. As a result of the moral cowardice of these commentators, there remains to this day a sense among many on the right that Trump is somehow compromised or controlled. Such narratives serve the manipulation goals of the left, which wants to tarnish the reputation of Trump by making him seem more like a typical compromised politician, merely engaging in pay-to-play politics to pad his own bottom line. This despite the fact that he's the same man who had his mugshot taken and was struck in the air by a bullet, two events that would have frightened off your average GOP phony. Speaking as someone who also has a mugshot on file because of the tactics employed by dedicated leftists, it's going to take a lot more than a few momentary impressions formed by an incomplete understanding of a given situation to cause me to question the authenticity of Donald Trump, the man and the president. He remains our last best chance to rescue the republic from the hands of evil men. I wish these right-wing pundits had a better sense of the degree to which they're being manipulated not just by leftists, but by an influence industry which we now know spans the globe. My instinct is that 2025 was merely a test case and that efforts will ramp up to insane levels next year. At the same time, I suspect that this increase in intensity will also be carefully managed, not to appear overboard, as was the case in the Harris campaign and Project Fear. Demoralization itself is a more subtle emotion than fear. For one, it's not a primal emotion, and instead of overhyping a single event, it's easier to demoralize when people are overloaded by an endless onslaught of examples or well-intentioned questions. The goal of this technique is to form a dark cloud in the conscious mind in the form of an overwhelming impression. Because the points come rapid fire, it becomes nearly impossible to address them all, and the person is left believing that at least one of them may be true. And before you know it, you're convinced that there's no real path forward and that no matter who you vote for, it couldn't possibly matter. What's the use is a feeling that more readily resonates with the young or emotionally immature. Once they reach that point of despair, it takes something very powerful to pull them out of it. This time, there's no guarantee that Democrats will be foolish enough to attempt another assassination or high-profile murder that will galvanize the base. And, to be honest, there's no guarantee that they won't do that either. Yes, Donald Trump is probably the best self-evident case that who you vote for does in fact matter. But the 21st century man lacks a certain stoutness of heart and resolution of will. A few charts showing poor job numbers or slight increases in food prices or another international event that piques the imaginations of influencers with massive Egyptian bot followers is pretty much all it takes to make Republican enthusiasm ebb. Social media is full of gloom and doom campaigning on the right. Plenty of prognosticators are making the claim that between 2026 being an off-year election and the fact that Donald Trump himself is not on the ballot, that Republicans will take a beating in the upcoming midterm. It's the type of pedestrian analysis no one should pay extra for. These ideas are so thick in the very air we breathe, especially around our MSM news studios, which tells you that these prognosticators aren't thinking, they're repeating. Instead of proclaiming defeat before the battle even happens, I heartily suggest that people take a step back and rationally consider the situation from an elevated perspective. Trump remains our last best hope. The cards remain stacked against him even now, though he has surrounded himself with a much better staff than in his previous administration, which was fraught with backstabbers. Losing Congress would be devastating not just to his presidency, but ultimately possibly even his person as well, and our country. Not voting because of a bad case of the blues in 2026, that would be the most regrettable position any American could take. But you could almost be forgiven for getting caught up in that narrative. The people who are doing this are pros. They have a deep understanding of psychology, advertising, and propaganda. They're the people who figured out that the little red dot next to your app means that you'll open it before you know what you're doing. The same people who've convinced hundreds of otherwise loving parents to have their children gelded so they don't commit suicide. The same ones who orchestrate whole societies into overthrowing their governments so a CIA puppet can be installed. Sophisticated, intelligent, manipulative, the best minds in the world that are for sale will be roped into this effort. They've achieved remarkable success so far, turning politicians and pundits alike, the kind of people you've trusted, that I've trusted for years, suddenly acting as if they're skinwalkers or imposters. People you thought had a mind of their own. If they can fall, can any of us be far behind? Don't laugh. Being overconfident in matters of mental manipulation actually makes you more susceptible, not less. In order to resist this, we need to be aware of this global effort. At the same time, let's focus on what we can do on the ground. That includes volunteering, but also things like being on the lookout for any content that advances defeatism. When you come across an outlet, influencer, politician, talking head, or pollster who promotes such thoughts, don't do the silly thing and just write it off as a one-time lapse. Believe them when they tell you who they are and respond accordingly. Be wary, scrutinize what they say, refuse to take anything at face value. We're dealing with a push to propagate a certain emotional wavelength throughout the party. Our personal attitudes can act as barriers to that carrier wave and help keep it contained. I have personal experience suffering a sustained, multi-year psychological attack by an enemy that wanted nothing more than for me to feel alone and dejected. I was imprisoned, cut off from any real information. I had no other access to news but ABC or CNN. While behind bars, it's bad enough I couldn't be with my wife. While in prison, nothing we heard could be trusted. Our minds were sealed off by concrete and barbed wire, as well as by professional propaganda and disinformation. I learned that fighting demoralization is simple, actually. I realized I am the one who steals my will and creates bulwarks of resolve. I thought, I read, I wrote, and I prayed. Surrounding yourself with savvy people who are like-minded is important, as is prayer. Religion allows you to transcend the material and focus on what really matters, which is the eternal. When you do that, even the worst news about Trump being arrested or shot presents an opportunity to turn and trust the hand of God. So when you see the panic and screeching, that reveals something about their relationship with God and materialist worldview. And this is how I deprived evil idiots control over what I thought and how I felt. There's no reason you can't do this as well. Looking at the upcoming year, there's plenty of reason that you should. Become the eye of the storm, the person others go to for a sane take. After all, it's your mind. It's your heart. These well-trained and funded psychological operators aren't the lords of your internal realm. You are.